Welcome to the Sonic Conspiracy, a series where I'll be going over various Sonic the Hedgehog themed conspiracy theories. These conspiracy theories could be connecting the smallest of dots to create the dumbest of theories, or to be so clever that we end up making a whole new headcanon. Regardless of that, these are just conspiracy theories, so you can take these as seriously or non-seriously as you like. Today's topic is Sonic the Fighters, a game that seems so simple but actually adds a fair amount of things to the Sonic the Hedgehog franchise. Some things that I feel are sometimes overlooked, so I thought it would be the perfect game to start my new series about Sonic conspiracy theories. But without further ado, let's get right into the first conspiracy theory. And kicking off this series is a conspiracy theory about a character that was actually introduced into this game, that being Honey the Cat. But a matter of fact, this is actually the only game that Honey the Cat actually ever appears in. But why is that? What if I told you that was because Honey the Cat is dead? But of course I'm not just pulling this out of nowhere. For those of you who don't know, Honey the Cat is actually based off of a character from Fighting Viper. The character she's based off is called Honey, or as she's known in her first international releases, as Candy. So I'll be calling her Candy just to make it easier to tell them apart. So as you can probably tell by now, these characters share a very similar design, also a very similar name. Honey is literally just the Sonic version of Candy. But to make matters even worse, when Honey did show up again, it actually wasn't in a Sonic game. Rather, she showed up in the Archie Sonic comics. And in the comics, they actually could have fleshed out Honey the Cat's character since there was literally nothing about her known in Sonic the Fighters. However, instead of doing that, they pretty much just based her off of Candy again. So this character isn't very original on her own. Of course, that's not to say that she's a bad character, but I do think it says something that Honey the Cat closely mimics her Fighting Viper's counterpart. But going back to the topic, in Fighting Vipers, Candy's home stage has graffiti marked on the wall that reads, "In memory of Honey, you'll always be remembered by your family and friends. R.I.P." So it's assumed that Candy is actually dead, and if you've been following along with this video, you know that Honey is very closely related to Candy, so technically she should also be dead as well. However, that's not to say that this is a solid theory. While the message does imply that Honey is dead, it's actually speculated to referring to the character's original name in the Japanese version, as when it was localized her name was changed to Candy. So it's apparently saying RIP to the name? I find this pretty weird and I don't think that's actually the case. Seeing as how this graffiti also shows up in the Japanese version, I don't think it really makes sense. However, another thing that contradicts the theory of Candy being dead is the fact that she shows up in Fighting Vipers 2, which takes place 2 years later. So what is the takeaway here? Is the graffiti referring to the name itself, or is it potentially just referring to the fact that she'll die 2 years later? Or who knows, maybe her appearance in Fighting Vipers 2 isn't really canon? Regardless, I do think Honey the Cat can be interpreted as dead. Honey the Cat doesn't appear or is even referenced in any of the other Sonic games. She was only ever put in this one game. If we look at other characters that were considered obscure at the time, that being Mighty Ray, Fang, Bean, and Bark, Mighty and Ray both got missing posters, while Fang, Bean, and Bark also got wanted posters. It should also be worth noting that Bean and Bark also debuted in this game along with Honey the Cat, but Honey the Cat doesn't get a single poster in Generations. She's not actually referenced at all for some reason. There is a Honey advertisement in Sonic Generations, however that's actually just a reference to Charmy and has nothing to do with the character. If we go on over to Sonic Mania, we see that Fang, Bean, and Bark do get referenced yet again, but this time Mighty and Ray get full playable appearances, but Honey the Cat is nowhere to be seen. So it could be the fact that Honey doesn't show up in any of the modern games or is even referenced to the modern games, and basing it off of Candy's lore, I think we could assume that Honey the Cat might actually be dead. This next theory is based off of a character who also debuted in Sonic the Fighters, and is even more mysterious than Honey the Cat. Mecha Sonic number 29, also known as Rocket Metal, or as I personally refer to him as Metal Rocket. You know, just like Metal Sonic, where the metal comes first in the name. Anyways, there's a lot of mystery behind this character. Why does he just show up at the beginning of the intro but never again? Is he really the 29th Metal Sonic? Cause who are the others? Is the Metal Sonic we see in Sonic the Fighters the 28th Metal Sonic, or is he the 30th? Unfortunately, it's just assumed that Metal Sonic is what ended up replacing Metal Rocket, which is why we don't see Metal Sonic in the intro. But what if I told you that isn't the reason we never see Metal Rocket outside of the opening, and that the answer actually lies within the Archie Sonic the Hedgehog comics, where during the Sonic the Fighters adaptation, it's referred to in an off panel, is the reason that we don't see Metal Rocket in the original game or in this adaptation is because that his head is too heavy, and this means that he actually can't fight and ends up getting replaced with the Metal Sonic that we see in the final game. Now what if I told you that this wasn't a joke? Now it's time for the real conspiracy to begin. Now think of this. The only time we see Metal Rocket is when he's flying around in space. You know, in space, where he should be lighter than a feather, which means his head should be no problem for him. However, if he were to ever board the Death Egg 2, he would assumably fall over. Now fast forward all the way to Sonic Forces, where in the A-Gate stage we actually see Sonic trying to board the Death Egg riding a spaceship. Now what's surprising here is that despite Sonic being on the side of the Death Egg, you see that he appears on a flat surface when he gets close enough. This means that the Death Egg actually has its own gravitational pull. Now going back to the opening of Sonic the Fighters, when we see Metal Rocket fly to the back. What if Metal Rocket flew too close to the Death Egg 2 and got sucked into its gravitational pull? This means that he would pretty much be stuck on the back. Furthermore, we never actually see the backside of the Death Egg 2, both on our way there and when we're leaving. Despite the fact that Metal Rocket is only shown flying around the surface of it, we never encounter him. So that means Metal Rocket is stuck to the back of the Death Egg 2, and unfortunately meets its end when the Death Egg 2 explodes as he's not able to escape, unlike Metal Sonic and Eggman, which ended up escaping just in the nick of time. This next conspiracy theory is about the Death Egg 2. There's something that I always found weird about the Death Egg 2, and that's that after defeating Metal Sonic, Eggman just lets it blow up, right before the battle begins. After boarding the Death Egg and defeating Metal Sonic, the character actually activates the Death Egg 2 self-destruct switch. At first I thought this was Eggman activating the self-destruct switch, however the lore of the game does state that it is actually you who's doing it. This is where the character's eyes only look surprised when the platform is lowered, but not when the countdown initially starts. But I find myself asking one thing: why didn't Eggman try to stop you until mere seconds after the self-destruct sequence started? Furthermore, why would he put a self-destruct switch on the Death Egg 2? Well, that's because the Death Egg 2 is a trap. He wanted you to activate the self-destruct sequence to ensure your demise. Furthermore, he even locks you inside a ring with him surrounded by lasers so you can't escape. What if Eggman wanted all of this to happen? Tells us Rocket the Lunar Fox is the only way anyone can get to the Death Egg 2 to stop it. In addition, it actually requires all 8 Chaos Emeralds. What if Eggman heard of their plan to board the Death Egg 2 and he wanted to take advantage of that? Because if he did, not only would he be able to kill Sonic, who is assumed to be the canon character you're supposed to play as in this game, but in addition, he would also get all of the Chaos Emeralds. And all of that just for letting them destroy the Death Egg 2. Something that actually supports this theory is that the Clone Fighter actually has a Chaos Emerald, but the Clone Fighter was created by Eggman. Now we could have given the Clone Fighter a Chaos Emerald in hopes of taking the others from Sonic upon defeating him, however even if the Clone Fighter lost, his plan would still be put into full motion. For the fourth conspiracy theory, we'll be diving into something that I think is one of the most interesting parts of Sonic the Fighters: the Clone Fighter. The clones in Sonic the Fighters are extremely accurate to the original. The only downside to these clones is that they're grayscaled, but other than that, they also have all of the moves of the original character. But I have to ask, what happens to the Clone Fighter after you defeat them? We never see the Clone Fighter again in any of the Sonic games. Well, there's the Doppelganger in Sonic Generations, but that's a whole conspiracy theory within its own right. Not to mention that it has no significance on the game canon, and is assumed not to even be the Clone Fighter as it's also not grayscaled. Anyways, going back on topic, what if just like Honey the Cat, the Clone Fighter is dead? And the proof of this is actually in a weird mechanic that's in the game. In the game, you can launch your opponent up in the air, but you can never knock them out of the ring. Even if they would have landed outside the ring, they're stopped by an invisible barrier. But interestingly enough, what if I told you you actually can knock them out the ring? However, you can only knock them out of the ring if you launch them into the air after landing a KO on them. So taking that into consideration, and the fact that Sonic is supposed to be the one gathering up all the Chaos Emeralds, this would mean that Sonic would end up fighting a clone version of himself. But where does Sonic fight the clone? Giant Wing, aboard a plane, up in the sky. So what if the clone actually ended up getting launched off of the plane and falling to its death? Or maybe it was actually done somewhere on the clone's part, similar to how Metal Sonic did in the OVA. But to extend this theory even further, what if the Clone Fighter you just killed was actually innocent? When anyone makes the clone of the fighter, you can see their expression on their face is just like yours. Just like you, they're probably surprised to see another version of themselves standing in front of them. This could mean that they have a pretty similar thought process. Which means that if you end up killing the clone version of Sonic, you're killing a version of Sonic that maybe acknowledges that they aren't the original. Which is also why they may end up sacrificing themselves, again similar to Metal Sonic in the OVA. Now believe what you want from that theory, but how does that explain the clones of Eggman and Metal Sonic? Both these clones seem to be absolutely perfect and aren't grayscaled in any way. Well, when it comes to Metal Sonic, it could be assumed that when it comes to creating clones, you can make clones of inorganic life forms that will turn out perfectly fine. However, how does that explain the perfect clone of Eggman? Well, what if Eggman was experimenting with a cloning machine and ended up using himself as a test? However, when he uses it on someone else, it doesn't create a full color clone. However, when you create a clone of Eggman, you actually see 3 Eggman. There's Eggman cloning Eggman to create another Eggman. It's assumed that the Eggman in the UFO is probably the original, as it would make the most sense for Eggman to be cloning a clone, I guess. Unless the clone is going crazy with a cloning machine or something. Despite that, what if Eggman actually made a clone for a reason? Like I mentioned in an earlier theory, if Eggman really did plan for the Death Egg to blow up, then it kinda makes sense that he would actually have a clone to take his fall. This could actually explain 2 things. One, why Eggman was so insistent about fighting Sonic until the very end, even locking themselves in a laser ring to ensure that Sonic couldn't escape, despite the fact that he could have also died as well. 2, it could also explain how Eggman manages to escape the Death Egg too, despite the fact that he's knocked unconscious. I know Eggman has survived various disasters before, but not really while he was unconscious on the floor, with only mere seconds to escape. However, there's also another thing that I want to point out. When you're taken to the Death Egg's hangar, you can actually see that there's multiple numbers on various doors. Eggman comes at the door labeled number 1, but what's behind doors 2, 3, and 4? Could it potentially be other clones of Eggman behind those doors? Well, whether or not that's the case is completely up to you. Now then, let's move on to a more simple theory. This theory focusing on Fang. As it was stated in the backstory of Sonic the Fighters, Fang stole a chaos emerald from someone. But who did Fang steal from? Now to quickly point something out that may or may not be the biggest deal. In Sonic the Fighters, the chaos emeralds are colored after the characters that own them. So while Fang could have stolen from a character that was purple, it's more likely that that wasn't the case, and that the chaos emerald was always meant to end up with him, which is why it's purple. But that would also mean that Fang was destined to steal the Chaos Emerald. But I'll touch a little more on Destiny in our next theory. But moving on from this, there's only a handful of classic characters that exist within the video game continuity. So who could it be? Well, we could assume that it's possibly a member of the Chaotix. Possibly Vector, as he is the leader of the Chaotix. And does anyone find it weird that despite that there's so many Chaotix, only one of them ended up entering? But what if I told you I actually don't believe it was any member of the Chaotix? Or even Ray the Flying Squirrel, or any of the other classic characters, as it's most likely stolen from Honey the Cat. This actually makes a lot of sense, because it was stated that in Honey the Cat's story, it aligns with everyone else's in Sonic the Fighters, that she too wanted to gather all the Chaos Emeralds and stop the Death Egg too. The problem with that being that, is that really the case if she never shows up in the campaign? But what if the reason she never shows up in the campaign despite having the same story as everyone else was because she actually had a Chaos Emerald which would allow her to participate, however it was stolen by Fang, which means that she was never able to enter. Also on a side note, on the alternate cover of issue 293 of the RG Sonic comics, it shows Honey the Cat fighting Sonic in a casino stage, which theoretically would have been Honey's stage if Fang didn't steal her Chaos Emerald. Theory number 6 is definitely one of the ones that take a lot of the smaller details to form a theory, but I think that's pretty fun and what I want to do more of. And this theory is what I call Hedgehogs of Destiny. This is a theory that Sonic and Amy were destined to fight each other. But of course it's more than that, because if you look around at the stage, it seems to be just a generic desert. But if you look into the background, you can see a sphinx-like statue of Sonic. Or maybe it's actually not Sonic and it's just one of his ancient ancestors, as there also are other Sonic continuities where Sonic has an ancient Egyptian ancestor. Or as we've seen in Archie, there could actually be hedgehogs that look similar to Sonic despite the fact that they're not related. Either way, this desert seems to be hedgehog themed, similar to the deserts we see in Sonic Adventure 2 which are echidna themed. Furthermore, it should be noted that Amy does tarot card readings, showing that she has some kind of connection to fate, or at least that she believes in fate, as that's actually how she ended up meeting Sonic in Sonic CD. And what if that's what led her to show up right here in this hedgehog-themed desert to fight Sonic? Matter of fact, what if this is actually why she got her hammer to begin with? As this is actually the very first game she gets her hammer, so what if she actually got this hammer for the very purpose of this fight? The 7th theory will be similar to our last one, where we'll be diving into very specific details that are placed within the stages. The stage we'll be discussing now is the Dynamite Plant. In the background of the Dynamite Plant, you can see a sign that says, "Under construction, Bean Real Estate." So it appears that Bean is the one that owns this Dynamite Plant. But what's kind of strange is that if you look around, you can actually see various stage elements from Chemical Plant, Oil Ocean, and Metropolis. It should also be worth noting that in the re-release of Sonic the Fighters, when you select Eggman as a secret character, his character is actually placed conveniently over Bean. So the theory here is that Eggman and Bean seem to be working together. Eggman even uses bombs just like Bean does, so this could be where he's actually getting them from. So could Eggman and Bean potentially be business partners? But if that's the case, then why does Bean want to stop Eggman and blow up the Death Egg too? Maybe Bean doesn't let business get in the way of doing what's right? Maybe he just really wants to blow up the Death Egg because he likes explosions. Or maybe he actually doesn't work with Eggman and is just using a bunch of Eggman's old abandoned structures to make his own factory. You can choose whichever one you'd like to believe, or if you can think of another possible scenario, let me know in the comment section down below. Our 8th and final theory, we'll be discussing the 8th Chaos Emerald. In every Sonic the Hedgehog game, there are 7 or fewer Chaos Emeralds, so whatever happened to the 8th Chaos Emerald? Now some of you might be thinking, well obviously it was just an error, or the fact that they really just wanted 8 playable characters in this game, and for each of them to have a Chaos Emerald. But what if the reason we don't see the 8th Chaos Emerald in future Sonic games just so happens to conveniently be in a game that released later on in the same year as Sonic the Fighters? That being Sonic Blast for the Sega Game Gear. Where in that game, it said that one of the Chaos Emeralds broke. So taking that into consideration, it could mean that the 8th Chaos Emerald broke and was never put back together. But that's not it, because there's still 2 more pieces of evidence that we can look at to support this theory. The first being that Knuckles is actually in this game. And the reason that's a big deal is because when Sonic was talking to Eggman, it was stated that Knuckles actually heard their entire conversation because he was close by. But why is Knuckles here, in the Green Hill Zone? What if I told you just so conveniently that in Sonic the Fighters you actually end up fighting Knuckles in the Green Hill Zone? Which means for some reason, Knuckles is still around this area. So I would say that's actually pretty convenient for games that release so close to each other. It should also be taken into consideration that Knuckles doesn't actually care about the Shattered Chaos Emerald, as the reason he's here is mostly to spite Eggman. Another point towards this theory is taking into consideration the good and bad ending. The good ending of this game suggests that Sonic and Knuckles gathered all the shards of the Chaos Emerald and put it back together. However, in this ending, we don't see Eggman escape the Silver Castle before it sinks, which could imply that Eggman actually ended up dying in this version of the ending, which we should know wouldn't be canon. And if we go to the good ending, we see that Eggman actually does end up escaping the Silver Castle, and it's assumed that the Chaos Emerald was never placed back together, assumably on the bottom of the ocean along with Eggman's Silver Castle, never to see the light of day again. But that's all the conspiracy theories I have for this video. I'd actually like to hear what you guys think of these conspiracy theories down below. And if you guys comment down below your very own Sonic the Fighters conspiracy theory, I'll actually consider pinning the best one I find of all of them. Again, it doesn't have to be anything overly complicated, it could be a small detail blown up into something major. But that's all I really had to say for this video. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing. But until next time, this is Jules Prime, and I'll hopefully see you all in the next video.